The cold air hit me before the door clicked shut, and I stood there on the porch in my black dress, holding a casserole dish I'd made for people who were eating dinner without me, listening to my own house lock itself against me on the night I buried my father. I'm Marguerite Aldous, I'm 34, and 3 hours earlier I had watched men lower my father into the ground, while my stepmother stood close enough to touch my shoulder for the photographs, and far enough that her hand never actually landed. Her name is Delphine. She married my father 6 years ago, 2 years after my mother died, and she has spent every one of those years perfecting a particular kind of smile, the one she gave the funeral director. The one she gave the relatives flying in from Ohio, the one she gave me at 8:47 p.m., when she opened the front door of my father's house just wide enough to say, "This isn't a good night for you to be here, sweetheart," before the deadbolt turned. The reading of the will was scheduled for 10 days later. Delphine had already told 3 separate cousins that she didn't expect there to be any surprises. I had a manila folder in my car that said otherwise, and I hadn't told a single person it existed. I want to say up front that this isn't a story about screaming on a porch, because I didn't scream, and that surprised even me. If you've ever stood outside a door that used to be yours and felt something in your chest go very quiet and very still instead of breaking, you already understand the kind of calm I mean. And if that's you, I think you'll want to stay for how this one ends because, I promise you, it does not end on that porch. I went back to my car, set the casserole dish on the passenger seat like it was something fragile, and drove to the motel off Route 9 where I'd been staying for 4 days. Because apparently that was already the arrangement. And apparently I was the only one who hadn't been told. My father, Walter Aldous, died on a Tuesday in March after a stroke that gave us 6 days of hospital hallways and one final lucid hour where he held my hand and said, "You know where everything is, Margo, you always did." I didn't understand what he meant by that until much later, but I want you to remember that line, because he wasn't being sentimental. My father was a man who ran a small commercial roofing business for 31 years, who kept receipts in a fireproof box, who distrusted lawyers slightly less than he distrusted banks, and who never once in his life said something without meaning exactly what the words said. He meant it literally. I knew where everything was. I had known for years, since before Delphine, since my mother was still alive, and used to joke that Margo could find the spare key to the universe if you asked her nicely. What I didn't know, not until the week before he died, was that he'd quietly updated his will, and that the update had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with something he'd discovered about 8 months prior. Something involving a joint account, a line of credit opened in his name, and $41,000 that had moved out of his retirement fund in increments small enough that, individually, none of them would have triggered so much as a phone call from the bank. The first small wrongness, if I'm honest, happened almost a year before he died, and I didn't recognize it as wrong at the time. It was just a missing seat. My father's 70th birthday, a backyard gathering, 20-some people, and a folding table with name cards Delphine had ordered from some calligraphy website. Every name was there: Walter, Delphine, my half-brother, Theo, cousins, Delphine's sister from Tampa except mine. I stood holding a paper plate for a full minute before my father noticed, grabbed a folding chair from the garage himself, and set it at the corner of the table. No card, no place setting, just a chair wedged in like an afterthought. Delphine apologized with a laugh that didn't reach anything below her mouth. "I must have lost the list halfway through," she said. "These things happen. I let it happen. I told myself it was a clerical mistake. The kind families absorb without comment, because that's what I'd always done, absorbed things so nobody else had to. I'd love to tell you I started keeping records that day, but I didn't. The truth is slower and less flattering than that. I noticed, filed it away the way you file away a single odd glance from a stranger, and went back to pretending the chair didn't mean anything. It would be almost a year before I understood that small cruelties, when they come from someone patient enough, are never accidents. They're rehearsals. By the time my father got sick, there had been other rehearsals. A family group chat that quietly stopped including me sometime that winter. I only found out when Theo mentioned an Easter dinner I'd never been invited to, and went pale when he realized I hadn't known it happened. A property tax bill for the lake cabin, the one my parents had bought in 1994, and that my father always said would go to me, that arrived with my name removed from the mailing address, and Delphine's added, 11 months before he died, filed under what she later called just simplifying the paperwork while Walter's memory wasn't what it used to be. My father's memory, for the record, was sharp enough that he beat me at gin rummy 4 days before the stroke and remembered the exact score from the hand before. There was also the matter of the company anniversary dinner, held every year at the same steakhouse off the highway, a tradition my father had started the year he hit a decade in business and never once skipped, not even the year my mother was in the hospital with pneumonia. The year after Delphine arrived, the seating chart changed without explanation. She and her sister at my father's table. The senior crew foreman scattered to a separate table near the kitchen. And me seated, for reasons no one ever clarified, at a table with 3 subcontractors I'd met exactly once. My father noticed immediately and switched seats with one of them without a word, sliding into the folding chair beside me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But I remember watching Delphine's face across the room. The brief flicker of irritation quickly smoothed back into hostess warmth, and understanding, even then, that the seating chart hadn't been an accident either. It was a test to see how much I would tolerate before I said something, and like the chair at the birthday party, I tolerated it completely. I think the hardest part of explaining this to people who haven't lived it is making them understand that none of these moments, alone, would justify the word betrayal. A missing seat, a reset ring, a seating chart, any one of them, isolated, sounds like the kind of thing reasonable people let go, the kind of thing you'd feel petty even mentioning out loud. That was always the genius of it, if I can even call it that. Delphine never gave me one large, unambiguous wound to point to. She gave me 100 small ones, spaced out, each individually deniable, each individually survivable, until the accumulated weight of them had quietly reshaped my entire relationship with that house and everyone in it, without me ever being able to identify the single moment where things had changed. None of these things, on their own, were a crime. That's what made them effective. Delphine never did anything you could point to and call theft, not in the early years. She did things you could only see in aggregate, the way you only notice a tide has come in, once you look down and realize the shoreline isn't where you left it. I've since learned, from a therapist I started seeing that spring, that this pattern even has a clinical shorthand among people who study family estrangement, a slow erosion of standing, calibrated carefully enough that the person on the receiving end spends years doubting their own perception before they ever doubt the person responsible for it. Hearing it named that plainly, in a stranger's office, was its own strange relief. It meant I hadn't imagined the shoreline moving. It meant other people had stood exactly where I'd stood and watched the same tide come in. I think now about how good she was at choosing her moments, always picking occasions where objecting would make me look ungrateful or unstable rather than observant. When my mother's wedding ring went missing from the jewelry box in the upstairs bathroom, the one my father had never moved, never touched, kept exactly where my mother left it because some part of him couldn't bear to box up that particular drawer, Delphine's explanation was that she'd had it reset into something I could actually wear, since it seemed like such a waste sitting in a drawer. She showed me the result, months later, a redesigned cocktail ring with my mother's diamond reset into a setting that bore no resemblance to the original, worn casually to a dinner as if it were nothing, as if it hadn't once meant something to 2 other people in that house. I said it looked lovely. I have never forgotten the sound the words made coming out of my mouth, how foreign they felt, how much they cost me to say. There was a winter dinner, almost 2 years into the marriage, where Delphine first used the phrase that would come to define our relationship. My father had asked, gently, if I'd be staying for the holidays the way I always had, and Delphine had answered for me before I could open my mouth. Of course she will, if it's not too much trouble for everyone, she said, smiling at me in a way that made the sentence sound like an invitation and feel like a closing door. I didn't understand yet that this was how she operated. Never a direct refusal, always a redirection, dressed as generosity, always leaving me to decide whether raising the issue would make me the difficult one. I stayed that Christmas. I stayed every Christmas after that, too, sitting at a table where my chair seemed to shrink by inches each year, where the conversation increasingly orbited around Theo's accomplishments and Delphine's renovation plans for a house that had been my childhood home, while I learned to make myself smaller and smaller in rooms that used to be entirely mine. If you've ever had a family member do this to you, chip away so gradually that by the time you say something out loud, you sound paranoid even to yourself. I think this story is going to feel familiar in a way that's almost uncomfortable, and I'd ask you to stay with me through it. Because the version of me on that porch with the casserole dish had no idea how much I already had, and I want you to watch what she does with it. What I had, specifically, was 8 months of my own quiet observation, because in the last year of his life, my father started handing me things. Not large, dramatic things. He'd say, "Hold on to this for me, Margo. I don't trust myself to keep track of everything anymore." Not because his mind was going. I came to understand, but because he'd started to suspect something and didn't want it sitting in a house Delphine had full access to. A flash drive in October, taped inside a birthday card with no explanation beyond just in case. Photocopies of bank statements in December, folded into a Reader's Digest he asked me to hang on to, you'll like the crossword. A spare key to a safe deposit box at First Federal in January, pressed into my palm at the end of a hospital visit with the words, "Don't tell Delphine where this is, not yet." I remember the afternoon he gave me the flash drive especially clearly, because it was so unlike him to be furtive about anything. We were sitting on his back porch, the one that overlooked the old vegetable garden my mother used to keep, and he kept glancing toward the kitchen window every few seconds, as if Delphine might be watching even though her car wasn't in the driveway. "I want you to have copies of some things," he said, sliding the birthday card across the table without ceremony. "Not because anything's wrong, just because a man my age should keep his affairs organized." I believed him, mostly because I wanted to. It was easier than asking what exactly he meant by organized and what exactly he was organizing against. There were other moments like that one, scattered through the fall, that I only fully understood in retrospect. A Sunday phone call where he asked, seemingly out of nowhere, whether I still had the same email address I'd had in college, the one from before I switched providers, and whether I checked it regularly. I told him I did, mostly out of habit, and 2 days later found 3 forwarded bank statement summaries sitting unread in that account, sent from an address I didn't recognize, which I later learned belonged to a notary public friend of his who'd agreed to forward documents on his behalf so nothing would route through the household's shared printer or the family email thread Delphine occasionally monitored. He never explained the arrangement to me directly. He simply built it, quietly, the way he built everything, assuming I would eventually understand the shape of it once enough pieces were in place. I didn't understand, in the moment, that my father was building a case. I thought he was just being a careful, slightly anxious old man who'd had one too many conversations with his accountant. It wasn't until the night of the funeral, locked out of the house I'd grown up in, standing in a motel parking lot with a casserole dish going cold on the passenger seat, that I understood what he'd actually been doing. He'd been making sure that when the time came, the person who knew where everything was wouldn't be the person standing at the front of the room performing grief for an audience. It would be me, standing quietly at the back, already knowing. And that's when I realized this hadn't been improvised on a porch in March. It had been building for the better part of a year, one small document at a time, and Delphine had no idea how much of it had already left the house before she ever thought to lock the door. The motel room that night was small and smelled faintly of bleach, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the television, the casserole dish still in its towel on the dresser, because I hadn't had the heart to throw away food I'd made for a table I was no longer welcome at. I thought about calling Theo, my half-brother, who I genuinely believed at that point knew nothing about what Delphine had done, and who had texted me twice that evening asking where I'd gone, his messages growing increasingly confused when I didn't immediately answer. I didn't call him. I didn't call anyone. I opened the Manila folder instead, for what must have been the dozenth time that month, and read through my father's handwriting again, not because I needed reminding of what it said, but because in that motel room, on that particular night, it was the only proof I had that he had seen me clearly. Even if no one else in that family currently did. At some point past midnight, I drove back past the house, not planning to stop, just needing to see it from the outside the way you sometimes need to look directly at something painful before you can let yourself stop looking at it altogether. The porch light was still on. Through the front window, I could see the shapes of people moving in the living room, the soft blue flicker of a television, the outline of Delphine's sister laughing at something I'd never hear. I sat in my car across the street for maybe 10 minutes, engine off, watching a house full of people, eating, talking, and grieving in a room I had grown up in and was no longer allowed to enter, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even then, that whatever happened next I no longer wanted back in. I didn't want the house. I didn't want the room. I wanted only what was rightfully, provably mine, and I wanted it on terms no one could ever again quietly redraw without my knowledge. The 10 days between the funeral and the reading of the will were, on the surface, almost peaceful. I went back to my apartment in Columbus, did my job, I'm a claims adjuster, which is its own kind of irony I didn't appreciate until later, and let Delphine believe exactly what she wanted to believe, which was that I'd accepted. She called once, on day 4, her voice doing the soft, regretful thing it always did when she wanted something smoothed over without actually apologizing for it. I hope you understand, sweetheart. It just felt like the house needed to be a calm space those first few nights. For Theo's sake. He's taking it so hard. Theo is 26 and was, at that exact moment, 3 states away at a friend's lake house, a fact I happened to know, because he'd posted a sunset photo to his own account 2 hours before Delphine called me. I said, "Of course. I understand completely," and meant every word of it as a kind of evidence gathering, not as forgiveness. There was a family phrase Delphine used constantly during that decade. One I'd heard so many times it had stopped registering as strange. "We're not going to make this difficult." She said it about the funeral arrangements, about the guest list, about who would speak and who wouldn't. She said it the way other people say please, as if it were a kindness rather than an instruction. What I came to understand, slowly, is that "we're not going to make this difficult" always meant one specific thing, that I was not going to make this difficult, by which she meant I was not going to ask the questions that would have made things difficult for her. During those 10 days, I went back, more than once, to the question of why my father had waited so long to tell me anything directly. I think the answer, the one I've settled on since, is that he was protecting me from the in-between period. The months where he suspected something but couldn't yet prove it, where accusing Delphine outright might have meant losing access to the very records he needed to confirm what he feared. He was, in his quiet way, doing exactly what he'd done his whole career running a roofing company, documenting everything before he made a claim, because he'd seen too many disputes collapse for lack of paperwork. I didn't fully appreciate, until the will reading, just how methodical he'd been about it, how each item he'd handed me over those months had been part of a structure he was building, board by board, the way he used to talk about framing a roof. You don't see the shape of it until the last truss goes up, and then suddenly the whole thing holds weight it couldn't have held a piece at a time. I also spent part of those 10 days going back through the 6 days of hospital visits before he died, trying to find the moments I might have missed, the things he might have tried to tell me when his speech was still mostly intact. There was one afternoon, the third day, when Delphine had stepped out to take a call in the hallway, and my father had gripped my wrist with more strength than I expected and said, slowly, carefully, like a man choosing each word from a narrowing set of options, "The box. First Federal. Don't let her near it." At the time, I'd assumed he meant some sentimental keepsake, my mother's jewelry perhaps, something Delphine might claim out of spite rather than entitlement. I told him not to worry, that I had the key, that everything was fine, and watched something in his shoulders loosen slightly, as if that single sentence had been the last item on a list he badly needed checked off before he could let himself rest. I understand now that he wasn't protecting a keepsake. He was protecting evidence, and he needed to know, in whatever clarity those final days afforded him, that it would reach the one person he trusted to actually use it. I spent one of those 10 days at First Federal, finally opening the safe deposit box my father had given me the key to in January. The bank manager, a soft-spoken man named Curtis, who'd handled my father's business accounts for years, walked me back personally, and there was a moment, sliding the long metal box out of the wall, where I felt the full weight of what I was about to find settle into my hands before I'd even opened it. Inside were copies of 7 transfer confirmations, a printed email exchange between Delphine and a loan officer about a home equity line of credit my father had never signed, and a single index card in my father's handwriting that read, "If you're reading this, Margo, it means I didn't get the chance to fix this myself. Take it to Russell. He'll know what to do." I sat in the small private viewing room at the bank for nearly 20 minutes before I could make myself stand back up. Curtis, before he left me alone with the box, mentioned almost in passing that my father had come in 3 separate times that fall, always alone, always asking quiet, specific questions about how joint accounts worked, how a line of credit could be opened against a primary residence without both spouses present, whether there was a way to flag unusual activity on an account without alerting the other account holder. He didn't say why he was asking. Curtis told me, but he seemed like a man trying to understand a problem before he named it out loud. I thought about that sentence for days afterward. My father had spent the last year of his life quietly teaching himself the language of his own betrayal, one careful question at a time, so that by the time he sat down to write that index card, he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what had happened and exactly how to prove it. I also found, tucked beneath the transfer confirmations, a folded printout of an email Delphine had sent to a home equity loan officer in September, asking whether a line of credit could be processed with limited documentation given my husband's age and travel schedule. Language that, read in isolation, sounded almost reasonable, and read in context, sounded like someone testing how much she could get away with before anyone thought to ask why. My father had underlined that sentence twice in pen, and beside it in the margin had written a single word, "No." Just that. Not an explanation, not an accusation. A flat, final refusal, recorded for no one but himself, until the day it would matter to someone else. The will reading was set for a Tuesday morning in the conference room of Halloran and Voss, the firm that had handled my father's business affairs for over a decade. I want to describe that room exactly as I remember it, because the details matter. 11 chairs around a long walnut table, a pitcher of water nobody touched, a box of tissues placed with theatrical readiness in the center, and a framed photo on the side table of my father at the roofing company's 20th anniversary, grinning in a hard hat he never actually wore on job sites. Delphine had dressed for the occasion the way she dressed for everything. A charcoal sheath dress, a single strand of pearls that had been my mother's, which she'd started wearing within a year of the wedding, and which I had never once mentioned out loud, because mentioning it would have given her the satisfaction of a reaction. She sat at my father's right hand at the head of the table, which is to say, the seat closest to the executor, the seat of someone who expected to be the center of what came next. Theo sat beside her, looking pale and genuinely grieving in a way that made me feel, even then, a flicker of protectiveness toward him that I'd have to set aside for what was coming. I sat across from them, three Aldous cousins to my left, and the executor, a measured, unhurried man named Russell Voss, who had known my father for 11 years and had a way of looking at a room that suggested he'd already read everyone in it before he opened his folder. Before Russell began, there was a strange, suspended few minutes of small talk, the kind that happens at the edges of grief when nobody quite knows how to fill silence appropriately. Delphine's sister from Tampa commented on the weather. One of the cousins asked Theo about graduate school. I said almost nothing, watching Delphine's hands instead, the way she kept smoothing the same invisible wrinkle out of her dress. Over and over, a small tell I'd never noticed in 6 years of watching her perform composure. I wondered, sitting there, whether some part of her already sensed that the script she'd rehearsed for this room no longer matched the one that was about to be read aloud. Before I begin, Russell said, I want to note for the record that Mr. Aldous executed a codicil to his will on February the 11th of this year, 6 weeks prior to his passing, witnessed and notarized at this office, which supersedes certain provisions of the original document dated 2019. He let that sentence sit in the room the way you let a stone sit at the bottom of a still pond, watching the ripples reach the edges. Delphine's hand, resting on the table, went very slightly still. I'd ask everyone to remain seated until I've finished reading the relevant sections in full. I watched her face do something I'd waited 6 years to see. Not panic, not yet, just the faint recalibration of someone realizing the script she'd memorized was for the wrong play. Russell read through the preliminary language first, the standard clauses, and I let myself look, briefly, at the framed photograph of my father in his ridiculous hard hat, because some part of me needed to look at him instead of at her while this happened. Then Russell reached the section that mattered, and I watched Delphine's spine straighten the way it had at the funeral, performing composure for an audience that was, this time, entirely uninterested in her composure. To my wife, Delphine Aldous, I leave the sum of $75,000, along with my personal effects excluding those specified below, in recognition of our marriage. A pause. Russell's voice didn't change register, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd dramatized it. To my son, Theo Aldous, I leave my interest in Aldous Roofing and Sheet Metal to be held in trust until his 30th birthday, with Russell Voss as trustee. Another pause, and I felt every eye at that table shift toward me, including Delphine's, including, for the first time that morning, real fear in it. To my daughter, Marguerite Aldous, I leave the property located at 14 Birchwood Lane, commonly known as the Lake Cabin, free and clear, along with the contents of Safe Deposit Box 271 at First Federal Bank and the remainder of my estate, including all retirement and investment accounts held in my name, after the specific bequests above have been satisfied. The remainder of the estate, after a year of $41,000 siphoned out of a retirement account in amounts too small to flag, after a property tax bill quietly retitled, after a chair with no name card was just over $600,000. Delphine's mouth opened slightly. That account, she said, and her voice had lost its funeral softness entirely. Gone thin and quick, the retirement account. Walter and I discussed moving funds for the kitchen renovation. That money was, Mrs. Aldous, Russell said, still even, still unhurried. I'd like to come back to that. There's a second matter I need to address while everyone is here. He opened a second folder, and I felt the room's temperature change before he said another word, because I was the only person at that table who already knew what was in it. Mr. Aldous retained copies of 7 electronic transfers made from his retirement account between June and December of last year, totaling $41,200, moved into an account held jointly by Delphine and Theo Aldous. He flagged these to me directly in January, along with documentation, and asked that I review them in the event of his death. He looked up. I have reviewed them. Theo, were you aware these transfers were occurring? Theo's face went the color of the tablecloth. She told me it was for the cabin renovation that Dad knew, that it was just easier to move it through my account because his was getting flagged for fraud holds. It was never flagged for fraud holds, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since sitting down, and I said it quietly, which is exactly why it landed the way it did. I have the statements. There were no fraud holds on that account in 2025. I checked because Dad gave me copies in December and asked me to. The silence that followed was the kind I'd been waiting 6 years for, and I felt no triumph in it, which surprised me. I felt something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. Delphine turned to me, and for one unguarded second, the smile was completely gone, replaced by something raw and calculating in equal measure. You've been keeping records, she said. Not a question, an accusation as if documentation were itself the crime. He gave them to me, I said. He didn't trust the house. I didn't understand why until now. She tried briefly to recover the room. This is a misunderstanding, Russell. Walter and I talked about this money constantly. He was getting confused near the end. His medication. But Russell simply slid a single page across the table, and I watched her read it, and I watched the moment she understood that my father had anticipated this exact sentence. It was a letter, handwritten, dated February 11th, the same day as the codicil. Russell read the relevant portion aloud, his voice steady. I want it on record that my mind is clear and my memory is intact, as Dr. Anil Parikh can confirm, and that the transfers from my retirement account were not authorized or discussed with me. I am leaving this letter so that no one can later claim my judgment was in question. My daughter Margo has always been the one who actually listens. She'll know what to do with this. I didn't cry at that table, though I came close, not from grief exactly, but from the strange late vindication of hearing him say, in his own handwriting, that he'd seen me the whole time. There was one more document Russell hadn't yet introduced, and he saved it, I think deliberately, for the moment after the letter had already done its work, and the room had no defenses left to put up against it. It was a brief statement from Dr. Anil Parikh, my father's longtime physician, dated the same week as the codicil, confirming in plain clinical language that Walter Aldous showed no signs of cognitive decline, memory impairment, or diminished capacity at the time of his examination, and that he had specifically requested the evaluation. In his own words, to put certain matters beyond dispute. Hearing that read aloud, I understood for the first time just how deliberately my father had armored every piece of this against the exact arguments Delphine would eventually try and make. He hadn't simply suspected she might contest his decisions. He had anticipated, almost word for word, the shape her objections would take and built his case to close each door before she ever reached for the handle. Delphine's sister from Tampa, who had been quiet through all of this, finally spoke, her voice tight with the particular embarrassment of someone watching a performance fall apart in real time. Delphine, what is he talking about? Delphine didn't answer her. She was looking at me instead, and for a moment I thought she might finally say something honest, something that resembled an apology, but what came out instead was smaller and meaner than that. You always thought you were better than the rest of us, she said. Quiet little Margo, always watching, always so sure she knew best. I let that sit in the room without responding to it, because I'd learned, somewhere over the previous year of holding my father's secrets, that silence in the right moment says more than any retort could. The fallout, in the weeks that followed, looked exactly like fallout always looks, just smaller and pettier than you'd expect after a sentence that dramatic. Delphine called Theo 11 times in 2 days, according to Theo, who told me this himself over coffee 3 weeks later, visibly trying to rebuild something between us that her years of small omissions had worn down. He told me, haltingly, that he'd had no idea about the transfer's true purpose, that he'd trusted her explanation the way you trust a parent's explanation when you're 26 and grieving and don't yet know to ask harder questions. I believed him. I'd watched his face in that conference room, and there's a particular kind of shock that can't be faked. The look of someone realizing the ground under them was never as solid as they thought. We've spoken more in the month since than we did in the entire 6 years before, and there's a strange, unexpected comfort in that. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something real built from what was left standing. That coffee meeting ran almost 2 hours, longer than either of us expected, and somewhere in the middle of it, Theo said something that has stayed with me since. He said he used to envy how calm I always seemed at family gatherings, how unbothered, and that it had never once occurred to him that the calm might have been a kind of armor rather than an absence of feeling. "I thought you just didn't care that much," he said. "I think I needed you to not care, because it made it easier not to notice what was happening." I told him I didn't blame him for that. He was a teenager when Delphine married our father, still living at home, still entirely dependent on the version of family she was constructing around him. He hadn't had the years of comparison I'd had, the memory of what the house felt like before, the ability to clock each small substitution as it happened. We agreed that afternoon to keep talking, and we have, in fits and starts, the way two people rebuild something neither of them fully understands the shape of yet. Delphine called me twice, once with the soft funeral voice, asking if we couldn't find a way to handle this as a family privately, and once, when that didn't work, with a different voice entirely, threatening a contest of the will that her own attorney, when she actually consulted one, apparently advised her against pursuing, given the documentation. The aunt from Tampa stopped calling Delphine and started calling me instead, full of the kind of warmth that only shows up once it's safe. The cousins who had sat quietly through the will reading sent careful, apologetic texts over the following weeks, the kind that thread the needle between concern and self-preservation, and I answered most of them politely and let the friendships fade anyway, because I'd learned something that month about which relationships had ever actually been mine and which had simply been adjacent to my father's goodwill. The attorney Delphine eventually consulted, according to Theo, spent less than 20 minutes reviewing the documentation before telling her, in essentially these words, that contesting a codicil supported by a contemporaneous medical evaluation and a notarized letter explicitly anticipating the contest itself was not a matter of strategy but a matter of arithmetic, and that she should expect to lose, and to pay for the privilege of losing. She didn't pursue it. What she pursued instead, for a few weeks, was a kind of quiet campaign through the extended family, calling distant relatives I barely knew to suggest, in careful, regretful language, that grief had made me controlling and difficult to reach, that I'd always had a complicated relationship with sharing. Two of those relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, called me directly to ask what was going on, and I told them plainly, without embellishment, what the documents showed. Neither of them called Delphine back. As far as I know, there was a particular afternoon, about 6 weeks after the will reading, when Delphine showed up unannounced at my apartment, something she had never once done in 6 years of marriage to my father. I almost didn't let her in. I stood in the doorway the way she had once stood in my father's doorway, and for a moment I considered closing it the way she had closed hers, just to see if the symmetry would mean anything to her. Instead, I let her in because I wasn't her, and that distinction mattered to me more than the satisfaction would have. She sat on my couch and, for the first time I could remember, didn't perform anything. She looked tired and older than I'd ever let myself notice before, and she said, I didn't think he'd actually do anything about it. I thought he'd let it go, the way he let everything go. I asked her what she meant by that, and she said, quietly, Your father avoided conflict his whole life. I thought that included this. I told her that wasn't avoidance, that was patience, and that she had mistaken the two because she'd never had to develop patience herself. She tried, near the end of that visit, to explain herself in a way that wasn't quite an apology, but wasn't quite a justification either. Something in between, the way people talk when they're still deciding which version of events they intend to live with afterward. She said the money had started as something small, a few $1,000s to cover a gap during a slow season at her own consulting business, fully intending to pay it back before my father noticed. She said it had been easier the second time, and the third, because nothing had happened after the first. No alarm had sounded. No one had asked any questions, and somewhere in that silence she'd convinced herself the money had simply become available to her. The way unguarded things sometimes start to feel like they belong to whoever is closest to them. I didn't argue with her account of how it began. I told her only that however it began, it hadn't stayed small, and that my father had noticed far earlier than she ever realized, and had simply chosen, characteristically, to handle it quietly rather than confront her while he still had the chance to be wrong about what he suspected. She left without saying much else, and I haven't heard from her since, except through Theo, who mentioned in May that she'd moved into a rental 2 towns over and had stopped attending the roofing company's annual summer barbecue, an event she used to host herself in my father's backyard under string lights she'd had installed the year after my mother died. I sold the cabin eventually, not because I didn't want it, but because every room in it held a version of my father I wanted to remember without Delphine's 6 years layered over the top. And I used part of what it sold for to do something quieter and, to me, more meaningful. I had the chair from his 70th birthday, the folding one with no name card, refinished and brought to my apartment, where it sits in the corner of my living room now, not as a wound, but as a reminder that I was always exactly where I belonged, even when someone else decided I shouldn't be. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the full story, whether I regret not confronting Delphine sooner, whether a year of silent observation cost me something I can't get back. I've thought about that question more than almost any other since March, and the answer I keep arriving at is no. Not because the silence didn't cost me anything, but because it bought something more valuable than it cost. If I had confronted her at the 70th birthday party over a missing chair, I would have had nothing but my own certainty, easily dismissed as oversensitivity, easily smoothed over with another soft apology that meant nothing. By waiting, by watching, by letting my father do what he was already quietly doing on his own, I ended up with something no one in that room could argue with. Not my version of events, his. There's a particular kind of grief that runs alongside relief. The two of them braided so tightly together, it's hard to feel one without the other. And I've spent a long time this year trying to sit with both rather than rushing past either. I grieve the version of my father who spent his last healthy year quietly building a legal case instead of simply enjoying retirement, who spent afternoons at First Federal asking careful questions about joint accounts instead of fishing, the hobby he'd talked about taking up for 30 years and never had time for. I grieve the 6 Christmases I spent making myself smaller in a house that used to be entirely mine, the years I told myself I was being gracious when really I was just absorbing what no one should have to absorb. And, alongside all of that, I feel something that can only honestly be called relief. Relief that he saw it, relief that he documented it, relief that the last work of his life, in some sense, was making sure I would never again have to wonder whether I'd imagined the whole thing. I think about that porch a lot, the locked door, the casserole going cold beside me in the dark. I used to believe that being the calm one, the patient one, the one who absorbed things so nobody else had to, made me invisible. What I understand now is that it made me the only person in that family who was actually paying attention, and attention, kept long enough and quiet enough, becomes its own kind of inheritance. The kind no one can lock you out of, because by the time they think to try, you've already taken what mattered and walked away with your dignity fully, finally, intact. I still have the index card my father left me in the safe deposit box, the one that told me to take everything to Russell. I keep it in the drawer of the desk that used to be his, the one I brought back from the house during the brief, supervised window the estate attorney arranged for me to collect what was legally mine. Some nights I take it out and read it again, not because I've forgotten what it says, but because there's a particular comfort in his handwriting that I don't think I'll ever stop needing. He knew, somehow, in those last months that I would need proof of more than just the money. I would need proof that I had been seen, that the years of smaller chairs and quieter rooms hadn't gone entirely unnoticed by the one person whose noticing mattered most. He gave me that, in index cards and flash drives and a letter dated 6 weeks before he died. And it turned out to be worth more to me than the $600,000 ever could be on its own. I think, too, about what it means that he chose paperwork as his final language to me, rather than some grand gesture or last conversation full of things finally said aloud. My father was never a man who spoke easily about feeling. He showed up, he fixed things, he kept receipts, and in the end, the most loving thing he knew how to do was build me an airtight case, because somewhere along the way he had learned, the same way I had, that in our family, feelings could be argued away, but documents could not. I used to wish he'd said more to me directly, in those final hospital days, about what he suspected and why he hadn't told me sooner. Now I understand that the silence itself was a kind of protection, that he was sparing me the months of uncertainty he'd spent sitting with alone, and handing me instead the finished proof, all at once, exactly when I would need it most. The desk drawer where I keep that card sits just below the corner where the refinished chair now lives. The same chair that once sat without a name card at the edge of a folding table while 20 people ate dinner around it. Some mornings I notice the two of them together, the chair and the drawer, and think about how strange it is that the same year held both the smallest cruelty I ever quietly absorbed and the largest, most deliberate kindness my father ever gave me, and that somehow it took losing him to finally understand which of those things had actually defined our family all along. If there's one door in your life you're still waiting on someone else to open for you, I hope this is the story that reminds you that you might already be holding the key, and that the people who try hardest to make you feel small are very often the ones most afraid of what happens when you finally stand up straight.